All right. Hello, everyone. Ranger William here from the Overmountain Victory National Historic Trail, bringing you another episode of Trail Talk, where we're getting to the stories behind the story of the Overmountain Victory Trail, trying to better understand the Kings Mountain campaign, the Overmountain settlements, and the American frontier. Now, when talking about the Battle of Kings Mountain and the campaign that surrounds it, a lot of attention is rightfully placed on the fact that the battle was Loyalists versus Patriots, and no regular British soldiers were present at the battle. Now, the usual story, it highlights that issue. You have divided families, divided communities, locals against locals, and then it will mention that there were these approximate 80 to 90 Loyalist Provincials, the Regiment of the American Volunteers. Now, deeper research into the campaign led by Patrick Ferguson, his tactics leading up to and including the Battle of Kings Mountain, it's going to greatly emphasize the role of these 90 soldiers. So who were the American Volunteers? Why were they one of the most used tools in Ferguson's arsenal? So to help us understand a little bit more about this unit, we're joined by Todd Braisted. Now, Todd is a lifelong New Jerseyan. He's an independent researcher specializing in Loyalist studies during the American Revolution, and over the past 40 years has been a president of the Bergen County Historical Society, the Brigade of the American Revolution. He's a fellow in the Company of Military Historians, and he also serves as a history advisor on Crossroads of the American Revolution, the Advisory Council of Revolution New Jersey, the South Carolina American Revolution Sestercentennial Commission, which is a mouthful there, and he has taught and assisted the National Park Service and Fort Ticonderoga's Teachers Institute in their teaching programs. And on top of all of that, Todd's found time to publish over 40 books and articles and has lectured extensively on Loyalists all throughout the United States and Canada. A lot of his great work can actually be found on his website, royalprovincial.com, which is a familiar place to many researchers who are trying to dig up info on the American Loyalists. So I think we have the right guy for our conversation tonight. Todd, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Now, talking about these guys, the American Volunteers, I always like to kind of start way back on step number one. So that's kind of our first question here is, they are called a provincial regiment. The American Volunteers is their title, and their provincial regiment is their description. So what does that term mean, this provincial regiment? What does that mean, and how long have guys like this been used by the British Army?
It's an excellent place to start. Provincial establishment is what the British created to raise American regulars. Now, we know that a lot of the Loyalists who were at Kings Mountain were militia, part-time soldiers raised in their neighborhoods and locales for service locally. But provincials were raised to serve anywhere within North America. They were expected to be under the same discipline, receive the same clothing, arms, accoutrements, food as the regular British Army. The difference being they would only be raised for the term of a conflict. During the French and Indian War, the provincials raised by the different colonies probably outnumbered the British regulars that were in America. The British Army, keep in mind, was a very small professional force. You know, I always get a laugh when I hear people say, "Oh, the British Army was the biggest army in Europe." No, the British Army was actually one of the smallest armies in Europe. It was a small professional, well-disciplined, well-trained led force, but it was small. That's why you had to raise Hessians. Well, the British had raised Germans in their previous conflicts, and they had also raised Americans as provincials in previous conflicts, going back to the French and Indian War and before that as well, going into the 1740s and even before that. So while the colonies were themselves not going to be raising provincials, because all the provincial assemblies and state assemblies and all that were not exactly operating for the British Army took over the job of raising the provincials, and that is what the American Volunteers were. I imagine we'll discuss a little later where they actually came from, because that's a fascinating story as well.
Yeah, definitely. We're going to want to get into as many aspects of these guys as possible. Which it does make sense as you're describing. They're called provincials because they're from the provinces. So I guess kind of an easy way to think about it is you have Loyalist militia, and most people are familiar with the idea of militia being local guys, local service, whereas these guys are pretty much British Army. They're just Americans.
Correct.
Kind of easy breakdown there.
Yeah, it's yeah. I mean, for all appearances, the clothing might be different, say in color, possibly cut. It was the actual description was supposed to be of the same quality, but not better. Yeah, that was actually as it was ordered. Same quality, but not better. So, for instance, many provincial units at different times wore green. They got new uniforms, like the British got new uniforms every year. The difference would be, a regular British regiment of the Standing Army was going to serve forever. All right, the 3rd Regiment of Foot, which ended up serving in South Carolina, the Buffs. They had the same uniform from their inception, God knows when, till probably now. Red coats faced buff with a distinct lace pattern. It would be their same uniform every year. Whereas the Provincials, not existing past the term of a conflict, it didn't matter what uniform they had one year to the next, as long as it was a good quality uniform. So if you were in a green coat one year, you could be in a red coat the next year. In fact, when the Provincials started in 77, their first clothing was green, then the next year red, then in 79 green, 1780 onward red, with different colored facings. So just because, people like to say, like the Lancers, we saw in the Mallow McGregor book, that red-faced blue guy. So that was the Lancers during the war. Well, no, that was the Lancers in 1783 from a description. For most of the war, the Lancers was in red-faced green. So it's hard to tell the players without a scorecard. It really is.
Especially when the jerseys keep changing. Okay, great. Now, so we're talking about them, and you mentioned how the British Army, again, they're a professional force. These guys are in it not just for the conflict like the Provincials, but they're professional soldiers, but it's a small army. So when you're dealing with a massive insurrection like the British are in the American colonies, you're sending your army across. You're dealing with a hostile population of about 2.5 million. Do we know how many Provincials the British raised during the Revolutionary War?
It's hard to say. We could wish the records were better. They're not. We're happy for what's around. Don't get me wrong. But I'm greedy. I want everything. But you can't have everything. Where would you put it? It's hard to really say how many there were. There are no muster rolls, for instance, for the most part before August of 1777. God knows how many guys served and left, died, deserted, discharged, whatever, before then. And then there's men who served who were not Provincials, your militia, your refugee groups, regiments raised by governors, like Dunmore raising the Ethiopian Regiment, and the Governor Toynin raising the East Florida Rangers. These are all different regiments that are not Provincials. So it's hard to say. And then you get some Provincials becoming British regulars, like the Royal Highland Immigrants, one of the largest provincial regiments raised in the war, on Christmas 1778, became the 84th Regiment of Foot. Boom, they're no longer Provincials, they're British regulars. So all of a sudden you lose all those guys from the rolls of the Provincials, and they're on the rolls of the regular army now. So there is probably about 50,000 Americans who fight for the British, of which maybe half you could classify as Provincials, and the other half, everything else I just mentioned. And of course, they're not all serving at one time. That's
right.
Keeping on. There's no giant 25,000 man corps, running around America. At any one time, there's probably around 8,000-9,000 present, fit for duty, sick, on command, prisoner, whatever, and serving on detachments. Really killed a lot of them. Not so much perhaps physically, but the core. They didn't. If you have a 400-man regiment, and all of a sudden you're detaching 30 guys here, 40 guys here, 50 guys there, you don't have much of a regiment left. Bannister Tarleton actually described it as trying to defend a house by lopping off each of his appendages and placing one at each window. It doesn't work. So that was a hard thing to do.
So you kind of touched on my next part of the question here too, talking about breaking these regiments into detachments, and like you were describing, trying to keep track of the numbers and all the little nuances that can determine if they're a provincial or not. That must be a nightmare of record keeping. But do we know how the British used these provincial soldiers? Because I imagine they're colonists raised for this service during the war. They must face the same issues the early Continental Army did, of how do we create soldiers out of these civilians. So the British couldn't just throw these guys into line with the regulars, at least not right off. Do you have any idea how they viewed them differently?
Actually, in a number of cases, that's exactly what they did. There was no such thing as basic training, as far as, you go off to a training camp somewhere and learn the craft of being a soldier. You join a regiment, and that regiment is on the line serving. So you serve with a regiment that is actually fighting. I've seen muster rolls where a guy joins a regiment one day, and the next day he's taken prisoner on a raid. So how much could he have possibly been trained in 24 hours? So it really is remarkable. But yeah, the provincials were used. If you look at the Battle of Camden, for instance, you have the British regulars on the right flank and all provincials on the left flank. You have the Volunteers of Ireland, the British Legion Infantry, and the Royal North Carolina Regiment as the left flank under Colonel Lord Rawdon as a brigade, fighting against the Marylanders and the Delawares at the Battle of Camden, operating as a complete brigade and doing a really, really good job of it. I mean, everybody talks about how great the Marylanders were there, fending off all these attacks. Well, those provincials they were facing were doing the exact same thing. They were facing off against, fellow Americans, toe to toe. So you could use provincials as detachments. You could use them as, as a brigade, such as that. They help supplement forces. You could use them. A lot were used with cavalry. There's so many practical uses. In large-scale battle, they're on the line with the British. Just look at a unit like the Queen's Rangers, storming across Brandywine Creek in the face of all those artillery pieces, or Rawdon's attack on Greene at Hobkirk's Hill. At least half of his force there was provincial. So, necessity in the South meant that they were using provincials as the backbone of the army in many cases.
Wow, because again, like you said, it makes a lot of sense. If you have a small British army, they have to use what they have. So you mentioned quite a few regiments in your explanation right there: the Volunteers of Ireland, the Royal North Carolina Regiment, the Highland Immigrants. So turning to our guys, the American Volunteers. Do we know where these guys were from, which colony they were raised in, and was there any kind of specific reason? Was there a certain proclamation or a campaign or a problem the British faced that they all of a sudden started creating these guys?
Okay, it's an excellent question, and it really has two answers: the official answer and the unofficial answer. The official answer was to give an opportunity to men in the provincial regiments at New York who would not be taking part in the siege of Charleston to form an elite unit and go down and take part in the siege. The unofficial reason was to provide yet another deserving British officer with his own corps. As you probably know, the British regimental system, you don't advance steadily, quickly. It's not so much as a merit system as it's based on seniority and purchase. So you had a lot of very deserving, very active, very talented guys in their 20s for the most part. People like Bannister Tarleton, John Graves Simcoe, Francis Lord Rawdon, all regular British officers, all in command of provincial regiments. So Ferguson, who of course was a regular British officer, he was a captain in the Light Infantry Company of the 70th Regiment of Foot, later major of the 71st Highlanders. But his regiment, the 70th, was in garrison in Halifax, Nova Scotia. There's no bookshelves filled with campaigns happening in Halifax, Nova Scotia. So Ferguson, operated with the main army in America. So he had a rifle corps in 1777. He had another ad hoc corps in the New York campaign up Hudson Valley campaign of 79. So now they needed to give him a new corps. So they raised 175 volunteers, officers included, from the provincials, mostly the provincials that were not going on the expedition to besiege Charleston. Now, those guys were from the Prince of Wales American Regiment, which was raised primarily in Connecticut. The 1st, 2nd, and 4th Battalions of New Jersey Volunteers, as the name implies, were mostly from New Jersey. The 3rd Battalion, Delancey's Brigade, which was primarily from Queens County, New York, Long Island, and Connecticut. The King's American Regiment, which was from Long Island, Brooklyn, New York, the Hudson Valley. The Loyal American Regiment, which is primarily from Dutchess County, New York. And an interesting little corps called the Nassau Blues. Nassau was an early name for Long Island. And this was a unit supposed to be 500 men raised for 9 months in Brooklyn by the colonel of the militia there. They ended up raising all of 60 guys, and they garrisoned this guy's house. So sort of they all got disbanded on December 31st, 1779, except for 8 of them under their Captain Lieutenant Frederick de Peyster, who had volunteered for some reason to see the world under Patrick Ferguson. So while the rest of the unit was disbanded, these 8 guys were on a transport ship heading towards Charleston, being tossed in a storm somewhere. So they were divided. All those detachments added up to about 175 guys. They were divided into what they called 4 divisions. Think of them as companies, about 40, 45 guys each. The most guys came from the 4th Battalion, New Jersey Volunteers. So they formed one entire division under their captain, Samuel Ryerson, who lives not far from where I'm speaking to you now from.
Wow. So it's just a great story, because you hear in the American side of it, these kind of units formed for different kind of reasons like that, like the foreign volunteers coming over, or I think it was I can never pronounce his name right, Lazoun's Legion of being British deserters. And then here you have Ferguson's command, pretty much a pet project given to him, pulled from these guys that, well, we weren't sent on campaign, but we want to go still. So they throw these guys together.
Yeah, they were all volunteers. In the military, the cardinal rule is don't volunteer, but no one had told them that. So keep in mind, this unit was a temporary unit. Once the siege of Charleston was over and the British presumably would win, they were supposed to be returned to New York to rejoin their units. This was a temporary unit. This was not supposed to be a permanent thing. The commanding officers of the units that they came from would never have permitted to lose all these guys on a permanent basis. So this was just supposed to be, go south for the winter, have a good time, take Charleston, go to a bar, whatever, and then come back to New York City and rejoin our ranks.
We'll see you in the spring.
Exactly.
So if they're just expecting to be there for the Charleston campaign and then back, you read some of the journals of Johnson and Allaire and the distaste they have for the backcountry service, being detached, being out on the western frontier. When there's one entry I'm thinking of in particular where Ferguson returns to them after meeting with Cornwallis, and he tells them that they're going to stay out there And the just writing, you can hear the melancholy, you can hear the depression of, oh, still we're out here, they're ready to go home. So that really explains that a lot more.
Absolutely. They went down there with, a certain expectation. But when Clinton and Cornwallis were sorting things out before Clinton returned north, it was the decision to raise the militia, or organize the militia of South Carolina. So they appoint Ferguson as the inspector of militia, and actually a New Jersey volunteer officer as his second in command. Not too many people are aware of a guy named Robert Timpany, who was a school teacher here in Bergen County, New Jersey, in the 4th Battalion, New Jersey Volunteers. He's placed as second in command under Ferguson, and they're to go around and raise up this militia and train them. Well, how best to train them? People might be familiar with the special forces today as a force multiplier. While a few Green Berets might not be able to take on, or possibly not have been able to take on a Soviet division, they had been expected to train partisans in the rear areas in ambush and tactics and things like that. So as 6 or 8 or 12 guys can train a force of 300 or 400 people, whereas regular soldiers don't have that sort of talent. And that's what Ferguson basically used the American volunteers to do. Use them as special forces to help train these militia, to make them into quasi-soldiers, to give them a chance in battle where that they might not normally otherwise have. So it's I can understand Ferguson wanting to do this. I can understand the British wanting to do this. For the poor Slavs and the American volunteers, it may have seemed fun, or exciting at first. Undoubtedly, it was the first time most of them had been in South Carolina. But you want to go home eventually. And what hurt also was that in April of 1780, there was a reinforcement from New York to the siege, and one of the regiments was the Prince of Wales American Regiment. So when the siege was over, the men of the Prince of Wales American Regiment who were serving under Ferguson were sent back to their regiment. So he lost about 32 guys and a couple officers right off the bat, because their regiment had come down to South Carolina. So that automatically reduced his ranks by a significant amount.
Well, you just kind of touched on the next question I had for you too. Talking about Patrick Ferguson's service, and you mentioned it a little bit earlier about how he has previously commanded these kind of special corps. You had the Rifle Corps, you had this other amalgamation he had, and you was talking about the Hudson's Valley stuff. When you're looking at his service, you're seeing all kinds of light infantry training, kind of irregular tactics. Some people may be familiar with the famous whistle and the whistle commands that Ferguson was using at the Battle of Kings Mountain. And so this American volunteers, this formed up group under Ferguson, they're being used, as you were explaining, kind of like advisors and trying to help train and be the core of this militia force. And they're with Ferguson for a while. And do we know kind of how much of this kind of irregular training he would have tried to instill in the American volunteers before taking them into action? Because we have some very heavy casualties for them being used kind of like shock troops around the hilltop at Kings Mountain. So were they prepared for that? Was this something that they'd practiced?
By the time of Kings Mountain, the survivors of the campaign most certainly would have been the best of the best that was left. The guys who drop off during the campaign, are usually not the cream of the crop. But so who's left is probably very good, and he immediately starts training these folks on the transports before they even get. When they originally went down south, they landed at Savannah. And then marched from Savannah to join the siege of Charleston. So they had plenty of time to actually train in Georgia, almost actually over a month before they even started marching into South Carolina. So we know he trained them very hard because there are two existing orderly books for the Corps. All right. Keep this in mind. This is a unit of 175 guys. We have two orderly books, one from Anthony Allaire, one from Frederick de Peyster. Compare that to the New Jersey Volunteers, a unit of 3,300 officers and men, for which there are 0 surviving orderly books. So that too exists for 175 guys for a unit that existed for almost less than a year. It's amazing. So we know Ferguson is training these guys, all sorts of stuff. Like, for instance, the last guy on the parade, when the drums are beating and the guys are forming up, the last guy to fall in will surrender his rum to the to somebody, the first guy who fell in. Little things like that. Forming the men into messes. There's 5 guys who sleep in a tent. Those 5 guys are issued with 1 camp kettle to cook with. So he wants those 5 guys always together. They're cooking together, they're sleeping together. He wants to instill that sort of camaraderie, because you're dealing with guys from 8 different units who've never served together. So what he needs to do is try and mold them into a cohesive unit. Now, one of the ways he does that is by completely retraining them to act as light infantry. He calls them Rangers. Half of them are going to be armed with rifles, half with muskets. The reason for that being the rifles are almost certainly the British 1776 contract pattern rifle cannot fit a bayonet. A musket, of course, a smoothbore weapon, can affix a bayonet, a socket bayonet around the barrel that you can still load and fire the weapon with a fixed bayonet. So you have these men probably as 2-man teams working together. He mentions on their landing 2 ranks, the men with muskets in the front, the men with rifles in the rear. So it's working towards that, and we know exactly the commands he's going to use with either drum, bugle, or whistle. Would you like to hear a few of them?
Go for it, absolutely.
There's only a few, so he's keeping things simple. First is 1 short sound, flankers to go out. The second, 1 long sound, flankers and all other parties to come in. 2 short sounds, to march. 2 very long sounds, to form the battalion and prepare for action. And the men are to use their utmost silence, steadiness, and attention to be observed during this. 3 short sounds, to run or advance without dispersing in rough fighting order. Here's another thing a lot of people don't realize. The British Army was not shoulder to shoulder. Starting in 1776, they started 18-inch intervals between men, open order. It was the Continentals, by comparison, who were more shoulder to shoulder than the British were. So these guys are going to be in extended open order. 6th command, the same frequently repeated, Rangers to pursue at full speed. 7th, a short sound followed by a long, if marching to halt, if firing to cease. 8th, last one, the same, thrice repeated, to retreat. And for the hat, when they have no music, if he holds his hat towards the ground, they will lay down in the utmost silence. People don't think about British troops laying down. They picture these, robots, just standing, in these tight ranks. He's telling them to lay down. If he points forward, rear, right, or left, they will immediately face and march in that direction. So by that, he's giving all this great stuff to train these guys, and they do it. And how do we know they do it? Because a South Carolina militia officer who was captured at Kings Mountain is interrogated by the Overmountain guys to teach them the whistle commands.
I was just thinking about him. Yes.
Yeah, you know who I'm talking about. So, and he's, so that is just such a wonderful confirmation of everything that, we thought happened. And it just says, yeah, this is what they were doing. They were teaching the militia, and the militia actually, at least to some degree, picked up on it.
And the Patriots were trying to. I mean, I can't imagine being your average kind of Piedmont of the Carolinas Patriot militia officer dealing with Loyalist militia, dealing with some British regulars, and then going through a campaign against these guys. You're talking about half with rifles, silent hat commands, these weird whistle codes across the battlefield, and they're suddenly dispersing and retracting. You want to know what's in their playbook. You want that page. So it's no wonder, I believe it was Alexander Chesney who's approached, and he says, I want you to teach this. And he says no. So talking about their training, though, that brings up something else. Looking through the campaign leading up to Kings Mountain, places like Earl's Ford, Cane Creek, attempted at Kings Mountain, you have Provincials serving as dragoons. You have these naval cutlasses issued. They are doing these mounted charges, shock troop, flanking maneuvers, different things like that, but they're on horseback. Do we see this kind of adaptation happen often, where you see these infantry provincials being thrown on horses, or is this more coming out from Ferguson's mind, more of these on the fly, making them work for whatever situation?
Well, I'm not going to, far be it for me to disagree with Patrick Ferguson. But no, the British had thought of it beforehand. When Archibald Campbell arrived to capture Georgia and famously tear a stripe and star from the American flag, the first thing he did was take infantry from the 71st Highlanders, Delancey's Brigade, the New York Volunteers, and the New Jersey Volunteers, and mount them as two troops of light dragoons. And of course, with Highlanders and New Jerseyans and New Yorkers, he named the unit the Georgia Light Dragoons. That makes sense. So he's got these two troops of dragoons, and they would serve as, and he recruit a few Georgians into them just for flavor, I guess. And so this is your first instance in early, January 1779 of the British mounting infantry as cavalry, and they were later, reuniformed, re-equipped completely as cavalry. Ferguson's, I'm sure, never had, full cavalry accoutrements and whatnot. These 50 cutlasses, I think they got, not exactly a Potter broadsword from New York City. But you take what you can get. But the British were constantly looking for cavalry in the South before and particularly after Kings Mountain, because it's such a large area to try and contain. And, the Patriot militia is all over the place doing these hit and run things, and you cannot chase after them with infantry. You can't do it. So what the British did, particularly in 1781, is mount a lot of guys, and not just provincials. This is the thing. The King's Carolina Rangers and the King's American Regiment, both infantry units, both ended up raising a troop of light dragoons, both from their infantry and from new recruits. But they also mounted regulars. The 84th Regiment, the old Royal Highland Immigrants, when they were the detachment that they had in South Carolina, they mounted some of them. The detachment of the 82nd Regiment at Wilmington in North Carolina, they mounted some of them. The entire South Carolina Royalist Regiment, save one company, was mounted in the summer of 1781, because the reason they needed so much cavalry in 81 is they no longer had the British Legion in South Carolina. The Legion had gone off with Cornwallis to their destiny. So it left Rawdon with little cavalry, and the New York Volunteers, another infantry regiment, ended up, they converted their light infantry company into a troop of light dragoons. So the practice was well established in the South before and particularly after Kings Mountain.
So not necessarily kind of a brand new idea for Ferguson, but he's taking some pages from other guys. He's seeing what's worked, especially in the South, especially when you're trying to cover great distance. And like you said, with the Patriot militias kind of doing some of this stuff too, he knows what his enemy's up to and trying to combat that.
Absolutely.
So this is creating a massively impressive unit. You have these volunteers, first of all, so they're not going to be draftees. They're not going to be begrudging their service, at least not at first. They're coming together. Ferguson is doing his best to build these guys down, the divisions between their regiments, and rebuild them through his training, through his messes. He is training them in all different manner of unconventional, irregular tactics, which he will need against an unconventional, irregular enemy. He's getting some of them mounted on horseback because they're going after a mounted enemy. He is really preparing these guys for the worst case scenario, but they're going to be the best prepared that they can be. Yet they end up at Kings Mountain suffering massive casualties and being captured. So the American volunteers, but other provincials as well, do we know what kind of happened to these guys after the war? Because like you were saying, this regiment, it was only raised, all the provincial regiments are only raised for the campaign, for the conflict. So being kind of on that establishment, was their fate better or worse than some of their militia refugee brothers?
Well, if we could close the book first on the American volunteers, yes, about 50 or so were captured at Kings Mountain, including the wounded. I think 15 or 16 of them were killed. There were also a few other provincials, by the way, at Kings Mountain. The garrison 96, which was composed of the 1st Battalion, the Lancers, and the 3rd Battalion, NJV, sent 3 officers and a couple sergeants to Ferguson to help train the militia as well. One of those officers, Richard McGinnis of the New Jersey Volunteers, was killed. The officers and the sergeants of the Lancers and the NJV were all captured there. Those who survived Kings Mountain and weren't prisoner or who had escaped were rearmed by the British with British and French muskets, and close to 35 of them were in the field by the end of January 1781. But with so few guys, they didn't know what to do with them, so they eventually sent them all back to their units in New York City to the relief of their regimental commanders. I'm sure they had a lot of stories to tell on Staten Island and Kingsbridge and whatnot. But to get more to your point, at the end of the war, obviously the British lose. And when these guys enlisted, one of the caveats held open to them, in addition to a bounty of money and a new suit of clothes, as they put it, was a free grant of land at the end of the war. This was an inducement held out to a lot of British soldiers at the end of the French and Indian War. That's why you have so many disbanded British soldiers settling in North America at the end of 1763. So the British decided this would be a good idea too. Now keep in mind, most of your rank and file soldiers are not landowners. They might be the son of a landowner, but they're probably, for the most part, probably laborers, very small farmers, and probably did not own their own land or a lot of land. So if in return for your service, you're going to be told you're going to get 100 acres of free land for yourself, wow, that's great. All of a sudden you're a landowner with all the perks and privileges that come along with that. So the plan had been to give the land in America. Well, in 1783, the British were no longer in a position to give away the land of America. So what to do? You look around to see what else you still own in North America. And for the most part, it was what is now Canada. When we say Canada in terms of the American Revolution, in 1783, Canada meant Quebec. When the Canadian Confederation of the 19th century was not how they thought of Canada back then. Nova Scotia was one of the American provinces lying on the Atlantic. There was no province of New Brunswick. There was no Ontario. But with the arrival of the Loyalists in 1783, the British were going to give away this land in the maritime provinces and in Upper Canada and in Quebec itself. Prince Edward Island, all these areas would be settled by tens of thousands of Loyalists. Provincials, militia, civilians, you name it. They were going to get, each private soldier or each male civilian, regardless, was going to get 100 acres of land. plus an additional 50 acres for each of his dependents. So if you had a wife and a kid, you're getting 200 acres of land. If you were a sergeant, say, you're going to get 200 acres of land. Officers are going to get 500 acres, 750 acres, 1,000 acres, depending upon their rank. So there's one problem with all this generosity. When the Provincials evacuate New York City, they set sail in the middle of September 1783. They arrive in the River St. John in the Bay of Fundy, what is now New Brunswick, the last week of September 1783. And the land grants are going to be all the way up the River St. John for many, many miles. None of the land is surveyed. You can't just claim land. Everything has to be surveyed out and doled out. So that first winter up there, let's put it this way. Have you ever seen any tourist advertisements for Nova Scotia in January? There's a reason for that. You don't go there. So these folks spent that first winter up there, in which they mentioned there had already been several snowstorms by November. They're sleeping in tents, not just the soldiers, but their families as well. 18th century tent, if anyone's familiar, no floor to it, just a basically canvas linen wedge. So there's a great journal about staying awake at night with the kids, taking turns brushing the snow, which they said was drifting to 4 and 5 feet, so it didn't completely block the entrance to the tents. Very, very difficult situation. A number died that first winter. Terrible circumstances.
Geez, so sounds like out of the frying pan into a fire. Especially like you're talking about with their families with them. When you're on campaign in the South, you know that your family's back in British Hill, New York. You are maybe a little at peace about that. But here you are just struggling to stay warm and survive. That is really rough.
Yeah, they're gripping, compelling stories. And what I love to do in researching the American Revolution is focus in on people's stories. I mean, that's what fascinates me. I've been a reenactor for decades as well with the Brigade of the American Revolution. And its motto is to portray the life and times of the common soldier of the American Revolution. Those are the people I like to study. Maybe one relates to the other, I don't know. But that has always been my focus, trying to find these individual stories, and there's tons of them.
Well, and so that kind of brings up another question I had for you too. Going through all this research and all these stories, we've talked a lot about the American Volunteers. You mentioned several of the different regiments that compose the Volunteers, the New Jersey Volunteers, the Lancys. Are there a few others that have really kind of stood out to you and are extremely memorable for either their service, their stories afterward, but you just kind of find them personally fascinating?
Oh, sure. One of the interesting things in doing the research is that each side has its true believers. You have your true believers on the Patriot side, true believers on the Loyalist side, and you've got a whole spongy mass of people in between who go to both sides. And you have deserters, you have prisoners enlisting with both armies in huge numbers. So one of the more interesting regiments for me to research is a regiment that was known as the Duke of Cumberland's Regiment, raised by Lord Charles Greville Montague, who has a connection with the government of South Carolina right before the war. He arrives, he's a regular British soldier, he's a regular British officer in the 88th Regiment of Foot on Jamaica, and he gets a warrant to raise a provincial corps. So he gets permission from Sir Henry Clinton and Lord Cornwallis to recruit among the continental prisoners, mostly taken at Charleston and Camden. The British had been trying to exchange these prisoners for months. And Green and Congress hemming and hawing about prisoner exchanges, the British just gave up and said, okay, recruit them. And so Montagu went amongst them and said, you can stay here and may or may not ever be exchanged, or you can come with me and fight your real enemies. Now, the British aren't your real enemies. It's the French and the Spanish. They're your real enemies. That's who your dads fought against. That's who you fight against. And you're going to go raid Central America. You're going to go to Nicaragua and Honduras, the Spanish Main, where all that Spanish treasure is, and you're not going to have to fight against your countrymen, and you're going to be rich. And it worked. Montagu raised this regiment, the Duke of Cumberland's regiment, 600 men initially. They were so successful, they sent another British officer from the 60th Regiment, Captain Geoffrey Amherst, to raise another corps in Charleston, the Jamaica Corps. He got 100 of these prisoners to enlist under him. They enlisted others under the Loyal American Rangers under William Adele, another guy from Jamaica, to serve on Jamaica. They raised over 300 of those guys, those mostly from naval prisoners. And they ended up serving on Jamaica. The regiment ended up being 2 battalions. It had its own band of music. It had grenadier and light infantry companies. And you think, okay, these guys must have been a real troublesome set. They weren't real loyalists, so they probably took every opportunity to get away. Well, number one, they're on an island. Off the coast of South America, not easy to begin with. But they become a really well-disciplined regiment. They get kudos from every British officer that gets in touch with them. And we've got, a lot of documents concerning them, including some court-martial proceedings. Court-martial proceedings, that must mean they did bad things. 3 of the court-martial proceedings for officers and sergeants concern abusing French prisoners. So it wasn't like these guys were trying to desert or insubordination or mutiny. The British were actually punishing them for being mean to the French, as French officers, as prisoners. So at the end of the war, most of these guys end up settling in Nova Scotia. One of the guys, Sergeant Nathan Pushy, had been a sergeant, originally trumpet major, in the 3rd Light Dragoons, and is captured at Monk's Corner. He ends up becoming a sergeant in the Duke of Cumberland's regiment. He goes to Nova Scotia, gets his 200 acres of land, marries the sister of another sergeant, who was a former Continental soldier, and in the 1830s reads a newspaper about the American Pension Acts going on from Congress. They're like, hey, I was a Continental soldier, maybe they'll give me money. So he gets on a boat at the end of the 1830s, sails to Boston, where he was from. They hail him as a returning hero. Oh my God, one of Washington's, he was one of Washington's lifeguard for a time. One of Washington's lifeguard is returned. They throw a banquet and a review of the militia in his honor. They expedite his claim for a pension. They not only expedite it, but they give him arrears of pension. So they're giving this guy who served as a sergeant for the British $1,000 in 1838. $1,000 in 1830. I take $1,000 today. Imagine how much you could buy in 1838. So he realizes after a month, I better get out of here quick. So he hops on a boat back to Nova Scotia. Before he can get home, he drinks himself to death. That's okay. His wife, as a widow, eventually gets a widow's pension and is still collecting money from the United States government in the 1850s. God bless America.
That is no wonder that that's one of your favorite ones to research. I've heard a little bit about Montagu's regiment, but that's got to be just chock full of amazing stories. So if anyone wants to kind of do some research of their own and kind of dive in a little bit more, find some interesting stories, some interesting regiments, their favorites, are there any kind of certain sources, books, websites that you'd recommend for people wanting to start out?
Sure. Well, as you very kindly mentioned when we started, royalprovincial.com, one word, royalprovincial.com, my website. It's your one-stop shopping. As a starter, starter for Loyalist information. It's not going to tell you everything you need to know. It's meant to give you an example. And I think we have 15 or 1600 documents on there. An example of the stories that you'd find in there. We have a great court-martial proceeding on there of Anthony Allaire, one of the officers under Ferguson at Kings Mountain, for shooting an officer of the Prince of Wales American Regiment in the streets of Charleston after a St. Patrick's Day episode. And yes, as you could probably guess, it was an alcohol-related incident. So that story is on there. So that would be your first place to go. If you want to read more in their words about some of the American volunteers, we mentioned the journals. Rizal Johnson was a young 20-something from Newark, New Jersey. He was a surgeon in the New Jersey Volunteers and acted as surgeon to the American Volunteers under Ferguson. His journal, at least at the start, is almost verbatim the same as Anthony Allaire's journal, which you can find published in Kings Mountain and Its Heroes. That book, I imagine you have that for sale at the park, Eastern National. Well, if you don't, get it. And you know that you probably find it online as well. But those two journals are really really good stuff because they're written by guys in their 20s. If you look at the miniature portrait of Allaire, and that exists, he's babyface. Babyface. These are guys in their young 20s for the most part. We forget how young a lot of these people were. Especially as you get older in years, such as ourselves, you forget that wars are mostly fought by young men, at least back then. So, fascinating stories.
Well, fantastic. So I want to just thank you again for all the great information that you've shared with us. I learned a few things myself. I mean, it's just great to dive in to these little parts of this bigger story, because the more you flesh out the details of that little small part, the more impressive the overall picture becomes. So again, we've been talking with Todd Braisted, independent Loyalist researcher, author, lecturer, website manager, just a great Loyalist researcher overall. So Todd, thanks again for talking with us.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me. Good luck down there.
And this has been another episode of Trail Talk, where we're trying to get to the stories behind the story of the Overmountain Victory National Historic Trail, trying to better understand the Overmountain settlements, the frontier, and the Kings Mountain campaign. So thank you for tuning in, and I hope you enjoyed.